Right. Welcome everyone to the next in our series of webinars where we are inviting lots of external speakers to come and talk to us about the way they use Digimap or the way they use data or the data that we have. Today, I'd like to offer a warm welcome to Rick Crowhurst, who's from Landmark Information Group, who supply us with the historical maps and have done since 2008, I believe. It's been a wee while ago now. It's very exciting as it was our second Digimap collection. We were enormously excited to have the history to go with the contemporary stuff at the time. It's gone from strength to strength, and it's one of the most fascinating collections of data we have. It's a series of scanned images, of course. Rick will talk us through this, and we all lose hours and hours and hours just looking at them. So we're going to go through a couple of housekeeping details first. Viv, can we have the next slide, please? We'll do some quick housekeeping. Then I'll hand over to Rick to share his screen and he will go through a presentation. We'll have a few questions after that, and then if we have time at the end, my colleague Viv will do a quick demonstration of Historic Digimap so you can have a quick look. Quick housekeeping things then. If everybody could keep their microphones muted, that would be really helpful, please. We're conscious that sometimes background noise can interfere with the speakers being able to hear the speaker. It doesn't sound very loud to you in the room, but actually the microphones are phenomenally sensitive. So if you could keep your microphone muted, that would be really helpful, please. We have a chat facility, which this screen highlights. You can find it along the bottom of your screen, I think. If you could type your questions into the chat facility, that's really helpful. That allows us to go through the questions once Rick has finished his presentation. We may not be able to answer all the questions. While Rick is with us here, we will prioritise answering those that Rick needs to answer. So we'll make use of his expertise while he's with us here. Questions about the use of the service and subscriptions and access and so on, we'll reserve to the end because we can answer those by email. After this webinar, we'll send you a recording of this. We'll also send you responses to any of the unanswered questions that we can get to after this session. And we will also send you a transcript of the chat. We will anonymise that before we send it out, so you won't see anybody's name in there. It will just be person 1, person 2, person 3. As I said, if you could keep the questions to the chat box, that would be really useful, and we'll get through as many as we can after Rick's presentation, and we'll prioritise questions from Rick first. Next slide, please, Viv. I think that might be us, yes. So, Rick, thank you very much for your time. You are very welcome. We're delighted to have you here. I think probably best if I just hand over to you straight away.
Thank you. Thanks, Emma. I'm just going to share screen, and hopefully this will work nicely for everybody. And there we go.
Yeah, that's it, Rick. I can see that.
Brilliant. Excellent. That's the first task achieved today. So thank you all for joining us. As Emma and Viv pointed out, I'm from Landmark Information Group, and we are the data suppliers of the historical map data that sits within Digimap. I will be running through a little bit of a background to the data itself, and any imagery I show you will be coming from our systems rather than from Digimap Rome. We don't run the service, we just provide the background data. So don't be surprised if you see some images that are drawn from our systems and you think the setup looks slightly different. The maps are the same, it's just the setup that's different. So a little bit of background. Who are we? Landmark are a commercial company, so we're owned by the Daily Mail Group Trust at the top of the tree. They bought us in the 2000s, but we've been around since 1994, and I joined Landmark in 1995, and the historical mapping is one of the things I worked on very beginning. So I sit in part of the Landmark Information Group called Landmark Solutions, and we are, if you want, the innovations and data hub for the group. So even though the group deals predominantly in property and land use, etc., we are sort of just geospatial. We are data intelligence and analytics guys. So the reason why we got obviously involved here with Digimap is the historical map data. And that sits at the heart of Landmark. So when we started back in 94, 95, we have a unique agreement with Ordnance Survey to create a digital archive from their paper, a microfiche archive. So that was an element of sitting, going through, scanning, and then geo-rectifying the map archive, sitting in Southampton in their old offices, and then in the British Museum and Trinity College Dublin and various places of various archives in order to try and get as complete and comprehensive an archive as we could. So we started that in 94, 95, took us 3 years to start to build the database. Everything sort of mapped to modern mapping based on the OS. So what we're talking about here is Ordnance Survey mapping. I will touch on some other mapping as we go, but that's where the archive is. Part of our two major agreements with Ordnance Survey. Our other one is the points of interest data, which you may see within your Digimap services elsewhere, but that is also created by Landmark in partnership with Ordnance Survey. So this is the kind of people we work with within Landmark. I'll just touch on that very quickly. These are some of my clients. I very much am public sector based, but we do work with commercial bodies, and we will work with data, geospatial intelligence, location data, etc. But as you say, the archive, as we call it, we call it the Historical Map Data Archive. The heart of that is the Ordnance Survey Archive. So we have over 1 million Ordnance Survey images, ranging from large full sheets down to microfiche plans. The archive runs from the earliest 6 inches to the mile, the one to 10560 mapping of the 1840s. The archive ends at 1996. That's obviously when we started the agreement in 95, that's when we chose as the cutoff point, OS chose it as the cutoff point. Everything post 96, they regard as modern era mapping. We are slowly discussing with them releasing more recent, sort of late 90s through to the millennium historical map layers. But at the moment, the archive stops at 1996. And this is the data that you hold within or have access in Digimap, from the most detailed town plans to the pre-war county series and the post-war national grid series, sort of urban large scale, through, and also the smaller scale, the sort of rural scales, if you want, of 10560 and 10,000, again, pre-war, Second World War and post-Second World War. So to break down the archive a bit more, and as I say, I'm focusing here on the Ordnance Survey archive, and the first 3 elements that you see in your list there are those that are held within the Digimap system. The town plans, just about 15,500 map tiles. That's individual maps that have been scanned, geo-rectified, edge-matched. The town plans, variety of scales, predominantly 1 to 500 or 1 to 5 to 8. I'm from London. I'm here in London at the moment, and we were at 1056, just a different scale. And they were the most detailed Victorian maps. Most areas only had 1 series, though the bigger cities, Manchester, Birmingham, London, have more than 1. Edinburgh have more than 1. And they were for anywhere that had more than 4,000 residents at the time. So they will, as the name suggests, be for towns and cities. There was also the slight question over whether some civic pride took over and areas were given them, even though they were struggling to get 4,000 residents actually living there, but they probably had 4,000 people working in some of the mill towns. But you'll find that those maps are there. The primary scale, and the ones that most people work with, are the urban scales, the 1 to 2,500 county series, and the National Grid series at 1 to 2,500 and 1 to 1250. So you have the pre-war county series, everything up to and including the Second World War, and then the post-war period, the National Grid series, which took over. OS created the National Grid in 1938, but didn't start producing maps to the National Grid until after the Second World War was over. I'll touch on the gridding in just a few moments. But as we say, National Grid series, that's more maps, but you have many smaller maps, which is the reason why there's about 340,000 maps in that archive, where there's just shy of 200,000 maps in the pre-war archive. We have added, as we say, over time, as OS have allowed us to release more recent maps to more microfiche working maps, which are the Sim, Suzy and Super Plan. You can ignore those for the purposes of Digimap currently. If that's of interest further down the line, we can add those. But I will say that if individually any of the projects that you're working on, you wish to touch on latter mapping from the 70s through to the mid-1990s, we can supply those maps as individual maps, either digital individual maps or imagery, if that's required. Obviously, that's just not in the system currently. So I was saying about the gridding, the county series and the National Grid series, for those of you who might not be familiar with them. The original county series, which is everything in the pre-war period by Ordnance Survey, as the name suggests, on a county by county basis. Each old county, and we are talking old counties, Yorkshire splitting up into the East and North Ridings, Cornwall, Devon, Surrey, Middlesex, all had their own meridian lines, their own their own working way of working, and often they'd have different surveyor teams. So you'll have a series of maps for Devon, a series of maps for Cornwall, and they will overlap. And those maps, as I say, were produced on full sheets that then were revised 3 times. So we have the first edition, and then you have 3 revisions. We call them our epochs 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they do reduce in number. And so the first edition is a complete series between urban and rural scales. And then we have revisions, almost complete revisions. In the the first revision was almost complete. By the time we get to the second revision, so the 1920s, it's only producing the maps really where change has occurred. It was an expensive business, surveying and publishing the maps. And certainly once we get to the 1930s and the approaching Second World War, Ordnance Survey really only produced those maps that were relevant. And some of those are redacted. You will have missing airfields, missing military sites that were shown on earlier maps and then maybe reappear. We're avoiding putting those on the maps. After the Second World War and the introduction of the National Grid, much simpler system everywhere, split up into squares, as hopefully anybody that works in geography in the UK will be familiar with the GB National Grid and how that works. And obviously everything is edge matched much more easily. One of the major problems with the pre-war period was edge matching, county sheets from different projections going to a different north, skewing. So you will find that issue when you're dealing with historical maps. So a quick rundown, this is how we tend to split within our archive. We call the urban, the town maps. That's the town plans themselves, 500, 528, 1056. We also group the very detailed urban post-war, the 1 to 1250 maps. We call those our kind of town imagery. So they're the ones in red. In blue here, we have the detailed most common urban scale, which is the 1 to 2,500, 25 inch to the mile. And then you have essentially the rural scale, the 1 to 10,560 and 1 to 10,000s. Anywhere that's moorland, highlands in Scotland, you will find historically you might only have 10,560 and 10,000s. They didn't produce the more detailed because there wasn't so much to put on a map. So that's the kind of showing the coverage based on that kind of system, what's in our system. You can see how the town plans obviously relate to towns and cities, the urban scales. And then as we were saying, if you look at the Highlands of Scotland, you do have some towns, you do have some urban, but some of that is obviously only covered by the rural 10,560 and 10,000 scales. So map examples. again, hopefully you've seen these if you've gone onto the system, but this is coming from our systems. This is coming from our internal web mapping system. So I've centered here on a part of Manchester, right in the heart of Manchester. And you'll see at the bottom of the screen here, we have a date range bar that allows us to only select maps from that date range. So this is showing mapping from the sort of 1840s and 1850s. And this is a 1 to 10,560 map. So not as detailed, you can pick out information, but individual buildings are not shown in the same way. But if we were going to a town plan, for example, or a 1 to 2,500 map, you can see the difference in detail, the quality of the map. This is slightly later, the sort of 1880s, 1890s, much more detailed, much more information. If you're working at urban detail, that's the kind of what you want to look at. But if you have got town plans, and this site in Manchester does, this is going slightly further back in time, back to the 1850s from that previous map, but we're getting a great deal of detail. These were originally colour maps. Everything we produce is black and white and grayscale, but because the colour doesn't tell us a great deal other than buildings, green sites, blue sites. But in terms of the detail of these maps, where you have steps, you're seeing the number of steps, you're seeing sort of gardens, and you're seeing, if you're looking at a public building, if you're looking at a library or a castle, Edinburgh Castle, you would see a great deal more detail than you would on the 1 to 2,500. So if you are able to access the town plans, they are in Digimap, they are the most detailed scale, and they're worth working with if you have them. It just depends on where you are and when you are as to whether they're there. Once we start to get later on into the post-war period, you'll see that the edge matching is much cleaner. You still will be able to see when you go between maps, because often they'll be from different time periods. The way, in particular, once the national grid was introduced, Ordnance Survey adopted the policy of only updating maps as material change happened on the ground. They were monitoring each square within the national grid, all the way down from 1250 scale up to the 10,000s, monitoring them, surveying them for units of change. So units of change, building changes, road changes, anything that's significant that gets units. Once a certain threshold was passed, then that map would be updated and published, whether it's published electronically or whether it's published on microfiche or paper. They needed to pass the threshold. The surveyor in the field would be recording it on microfiche, then electronically, but you wouldn't get a published map until units of change will have occurred. So you will find, even in urban areas, you might have a 1948 map alongside a 1951 map, alongside a 1954 map, all in the same square of area. It just depends on when the units of change. So you will find you'll have bundles of change. Often the 1950s produced a lot of National Grid series maps. And then after the Town and Country Planning Act in the early 70s, we got a lot of new National Grid maps. And then in the 80s, when we got a lot of release of changes in planning laws, you get new maps there as well. So it just depends on when the change. So we always say that whenever you're looking with historical maps, to layer from the bottom up, just layer on top the next map, because essentially, even modern Ordnance Survey master map is just a revision of those first county series maps. That's how I always regard it. They are always revising, they're not creating new. So a couple of the issues that we found, the nightmares of working with pre-war maps, the county series being one of them. And the fact that county surveyors overlapped. Here we always, Devon and Cornwall, Landmark's head is in Exeter, and we have lots of colleagues that work down in Cornwall, so they like looking at Devon and Cornwall. Devonian surveyors in the pre-war period mapped part of Cornwall on their map sheets. So they continued on and drew bits of Cornwall. The Cornish stopped at the border and just wrote, there be dragons, there be Devonshire. So you will have white imagery on the tile. So we always sort of rectified the entire sheet rather than overlapping, for this very reason, that sometimes, in this case, Devon and Cornwall, clearly the Cornish didn't survey Devon, but vice versa, Devon did. But in other counties, both sets of county series maps will have the same area, slightly different times, surveyed by slightly different teams, overlapping. So that's the reason why you will have two maps at the same point, at the same scale, in the same series, but they'll have been surveyed slightly differently. So it's always worth reviewing that when you're going across the boundary between counties. The same is true when we're looking at different scales. So in this case, it's part of Plymouth, the promenade, the pier. And here we have on your left, you have an 1895 map at 1 to 2,500 scale, 25 inch to mile, very nicely detailed, that site. But at the same time, also at 1895, they were producing a town plan. So same site, same time, different scale. So you can have that. You can have the same map at the same time, but you can have the differing scales. So it's always worth, again, checking your scales, seeing what you've got, depending on what you're looking for and what you're working with as to the detail that you want to take. We produce within our systems, and I'm sure that I've not looked at Rome for a while, Emma, so, but this is the kind of standard county series legend. Apologies that it doesn't look so great on the screen. This is just lifted from the side of a map. If any of you have ever got or looked, I do have one of the original sheets that OS allowed me to have of South West London, of Wimbledon, and this sits on the side of it as a legend. We also have some background books on more detailed information on what was used by the cartographers. Some of that is online now, so you can sort of probably just go online and find it out. But if there are specific queries, you can route those through the team to Digimap. If we can answer those, we will. We have had some very interesting ones in the past over these last few years, finding out information I really didn't know about. And that sort of, we're happy to help. That feeds into our knowledge and feeds into the knowledge of the populace. And just to give an idea, obviously we provide this mapping as a sound agreement to the local authorities, obviously to university sector, but it's been provided to local authorities, public sector bodies, archives, also around the country, and obviously it's used commercially every single minute of every single day. People working with the mapping in our systems for commercial purposes. We do have some very big users that take the data. Registers of Scotland, for example, have that as a direct feed from our systems, as do the National Trust, that we provide that and masked to their areas. We feed that out. They have the archive, as do Highways England, for obviously in particular for looking there where they're looking at dangers and hazards. One of the reasons we produced and worked with the data in the first place is to look at environmental issues. I used to work at the Department of the Environment, looking at issues for land conditions, land use change, and that's why we use the data, and that's why it's being used by infrastructure, asset managers, etc. every day. So that was a very quick rundown, hopefully, and it seems to be within 25 minutes, which I'm quite pleased about, really. So obviously I'm open to questions and discussions, and we do make certain that we keep the channels of communications going, and have done since we started with the project. The questions coming back into Emma and the team for how to use the data, what can you do with the data, what can we do with studies. And there's been some great use that we've seen over years that I've been engaging with the academic community on this. So long may that continue. Emma.
Thank you, Rick. That's wonderful. That's really, really interesting. Every time I listen to you do one of these little talks, I learn something new. It's fascinating stuff. We do have a good few questions, which is great. There are one or two about Digimap rather than about the landmark end of things, but we'll try and work the way through. Viv, if I do the first one, you do the next one. Yeah, does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Brilliant. First question, Rick, do you have any plans to work with older non-OS maps?
Yes, no, that's a very good question, and that's almost like a feed line to say on those.
It wasn't planted, I promise.
In our archive, we do have a couple of other archives that we brought into play, one of which is the GOAD fire insurance plans. If anybody who is interested or knows about GOAD were ultimately bought out by Experian, and they record information. But the maps themselves were, as the name suggests, looking at fire insurance. So they, again, are predominantly urban. They are predominantly kind of commercial and retail areas, but the level of detail on those maps are incredible. And not only in what was going on site, i.e. whether it's a printworks in the ground floor and a solicitors on the top floor, but also what was being used in the building itself. So from our point of view, asbestos, we've recorded that as a digitized that piece of information off. So material types, when we're looking at tanks, where there's petroleum tanks that are hidden away, fire tanks, those kind of things, because they were recording those because it affected the insurance premium. So basically they are setting the insurance premium, so we're looking at things that would affect that. We have that archive that goes back to the 1800s, the later 1800s, 1890s, but through to the 1970s. And we have a series of those. Again, geo-rectified colour imagery. They do overlap, they're small, and there'll be little bits and pieces. We also have Russian spy maps, which are great if you are interested in, and you know your Cyrillic. There were, certainly in the post-war period, during the Cold War, Soviet Union was mapping the UK for invasion, essentially, both on the ground and using aerial photography. One of the great things about that is we'll record public buildings. The accuracy of roadways and the measurements were much better even than our OS. Because the last thing they wanted to do was come on, rattle down with some armoured vehicles and not be able to ever get stuck in traffic on Brighton Promenade. But some of those measurements are great. So that if that's of interest. So we are always looking at other archives, and we are looking to go further back, but obviously there needs to be, from our point of view, a commercial imperative to do so. And so unfortunately we're not publicly funded, nobody funds us to do this. It'd be great if they did, but we are looking at other archives as well.
Good stuff. That your idea of the Russian maps might tie in with a comment from Jonathan here, who says gaps due to military sites are the bane of his airfield research. I wonder if the Russians have much, have the missing bits that you could fill in.
They might do, not so much on the pre-war.
No, maybe not.
Which I agree with, it is a pain, and the amount of times we've looked and seen where quite clearly the markings that either it's a very large cricket pitch or it's an airstrip, and I think the latter is usually the case. But the markings will be there, they just won't put the word in. But I'm sort of used to that, sort of finding those investigations. But yes, certainly in the 1950s, some of that information will appear on the Russian maps that will not appear, that will be redacted by MOD.
There you go, Jonathan, maybe that's something for you to have a look at some point to fill in a few gaps for you. Viv?
Okay, next one, Rick. What would be the best series of maps to find rights of way, mainly footpaths from 1840 to the last definitive map, both urban and rural? I'm looking for lost paths.
I would always advise to use, if you've got a town plan, use the town plan. But obviously we appreciate that they will tend not to go out far enough. So the 1 to 2,500 is by far the best. It's an interesting project. We supplied the maps back in the day to the Countryside Agency, as was when the CROW Act, the Countryside Rights of Way Act, which I think is 2001, I can't remember now. So the maps that have been used by what became Natural England and parts of DEFRA, and by the Ramblers to record, and they tend to use the 1 to 2,500. But if you've got a town plan, detail is great. The slight issue is you get the disconnect then going from one scale to the next, and you might get a slightly more detailed map sort of positioning, but the uniformity, you feel like you've got a kind of a dog leg in the middle of your path. So I would tend to use a 2500.
Super, thank you. You got another one, Emma?
Yes, I'm going to skip the next two, I think, because I think they are about Digimap. Somebody's asking what sort of computers you were using in 1996.
Oh, that's a great question. I will say this. I had a meeting the other day talking about those maps, and the person I spoke to said, "Oh, the year of my birth."
No one wants to hear that.
No.
I'm sure lots of people on this call are similar with that. We used, it's an Oracle database, but we already used Genamap back in those days. We did, obviously, we were capturing using a big light box, and we still have those kind of old surveying techniques of capturing the map and then taking fixed points to rubber band the image. But it was Genamap was the base. But it's an Oracle database that we still interested in Oracle, so they're still good. Yeah,
fascinating. It's hard to believe how quickly things sort of move on, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Very fast.
You can't beat a good old surveying light box, though.
No. If next.
There's a nice comment from Jessica to say she's partnership manager of Salford Lads Club, who featured on your Manchester map, Rick. So
that was well
happy to see that pop up.
There's two reasons for that. It's got Salford Maps, and it becomes Coronation Street. It isn't the Coronation Street, but it is Coronation Street in Manchester.
Oh, fab.
Wow, fantastic.
And then there's a couple of questions about the surveying. When did the OS stop marking on the archaeological features?
I would need to check that out. But it is a very good point. Some of the detail on the pre-war is better. I can find that information out, and I can feed that back to you as to what the date is. As we always say, that kind of, it's also worth looking with archaeological. With the first series, they will have historic site disused. So they might have print works disused. That will not then appear as disused in series 2 or series 3 or series 4, because they're saying we're just showing that it was there and we know what it was, but it's disused, and then it just becomes a building. So yeah, I mean, I'll find that out about the archaeological side. I could make a guess, but I'm not going to say officially what the date is. But OS will have that recorded, yes.
Yeah, if you could let us know, Rick, we'll follow up with the transcript from this.
Those questions back to me, and I can answer those.
We'll do that. Thank you. Next question is, how accurately do you think garden and nursery features were mapped in the early OS maps? Well,
again, I'm sorry to keep banging on about town plans. Town plans are definitely worth using. I've looked at a park here up in Wimbledon called Canizaro, which was there then and was a gardens. And if you look at the beds and trying to look at kind of the shaping, they were using a hashing to show where the pathways were, where the kind of the rose beds were, and where statue tree is. On the town plans, they're very accurate, and I would say not quite. I wouldn't say absolutely bang on the money, but maybe kind of within a metre. And so it's worth looking, and they record more information, so you can see how sort of public parks and sort of where sort of bigger buildings where it's a decent size. They didn't do absolutely every garden, but they're certainly worth looking at. On the OS standard gardens, they're usually either clear. You will have trees, and they'll have whether it's a conifer or a deciduous or a shrub, but it tends to relate to it might relate to one, it might relate to several, 2 or 3 trees, or even a copse. You'll see little groupings. So I can get a bit more chapter and verse in the historic, but the town plan's definitely worth looking at if you can for historic gardens.
Lovely, thank you. That's great.
Thank you. The next question, I'm wondering if we might be best to deal with it when I do a little demo of Historic Rome. Someone's asking how you deal with edge matching. Could they get an overview of that? And they're saying, is it a Digimap question? I think it's probably one for both.
Yeah. I mean, edge matching is tricky. We do, in order to get, obviously our aim was always to get a national picture. So you can always tidy up edge matching individually. So if I was only ever doing, even if I was only ever doing just 2 counties, Middlesex and Surrey, I could keep going and improve the edge matching. But we do lose little slithers. You do have to, it's a bit like getting a great pair of scissors out and cutting down the edge. However much you try and stick to the black line, you're always going to deviate ever so slightly. So edge matching is a question. It is definitely a question when you have multi-counties. So if you are in Powys, for example, in Wales, is affected by several, and we're talking old counties, we're talking Cardiganshire, etc. Again, in Scotland, in parts of the Lothians and Renfrews, you're getting multi-old counties affecting. So if you're on the county boundary line, you're getting effects there between edge matching on sheets. So our aim was to be plus or minus 5 metres on the ground accuracy. We could have kept going and tried to get it down to a metre, but plus or minus 5 metres is OS talk for accuracy. Even currently, they'll say plus or minus 5 metres on the ground, but some individual sheets, some individual points on individual sheets will edge out to the kind of 15 metres on the ground, possibly differentials, when we haven't got too many fixed points to work with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
It's a complicated process, isn't it?
It is. And yeah, if we were starting again, we would be able to do new things, but we're not. Well, the archive doesn't even exist anymore. It's format that it did.
Yeah, okay. Next question. Jonathan says he'd be very interested in the Russian map, so maybe you could point us as to how people could have a look at those if they were interested. Is there an obvious way to access them? Purchase them, maybe.
Well, from an academic point of view, research, this was done in partnership with the British Library. So okay. they were originally there. Some of those were British Library mapping. Some of it we basically purchased from a US source, interestingly enough. And so they are kind of, it's worth, I can point out, and as I say, again, the MOD maps in the data set, I can just see Jonathan's question popping up there. If you want to route that to us, Emma, I'll point both to yourselves and to Jonathan some sources that are useful and things that might be more available from an academic point of view than from a commercial use point of view.
That'd be lovely. Thank you, Rick.
From our point of view, from the Russian maps are things that we're not allowed to do, and some things that we don't wish to do commercially. They're for commercial benefit, but academically it's a different kettle of fish. Okay,
that would be great. Yeah, thank you. Quick one, next one. Is there an archive anywhere of rural estate maps pre-1800s?
Oh, beautiful. National Archive is the only one that I could point towards. We've done some individual work on individual estates for individual estate holders, and the information on there is incredible. And linking it to the text as well is great. But I wouldn't. We don't hold that, and we've not gone to a process of holding that. Either to the individual estates or to the National Archives. There's 2 or 3 in Scotland where the estates have been scanned and linked to the book of what was going on each tenant at that point.
Wow, fascinating. Okay, next one.
Next one, Rick. Can members of the public get copies of old OS maps directly from Landmark?
We would always point them to one of our partner sites. If it's purely for personal use, old-maps.co.uk is a sort of, what we call it, a B2C, a business to consumer. So it's one of our websites. Well, it used to be ours. It's now run by 2 ex-Landmark colleagues, and that allows people to purchase imagery for private use, personal use, purchasing imagery. We also do provide the maps through to a couple of other map providers, Cassini, who are a map publishing company. We don't deal direct with the public. We're not set up to do so, but we use these as outlets. So yes, there are a couple out there.
Brilliant.
Super, thank you.
Okay, next one. Are there plans to include the OS drawings from the early 19th century now in the British Library?
Plans, yes. Time frame, I can't even give an idea on. There are several parts of the archive that we would love to bring into play, and it's just a time frame of when and if they can do. And again, with commercial priorities, somebody turns around and goes, we can get all this coal mining data in, for example, and our clients are saying we want all that coal mining data, that leaps to the top of the tree. But it is on the list. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, priorities always are flexible, aren't they? They have to change. Yeah.
Okay, next one. Someone said, re-computers, what about the hardware? I'm not exactly sure what the question is there, so I don't know if that person wants to give us a little bit more info.
Yeah, I'm sending that too. I can always send some technical stuff. I will confess, some of the technical stuff was not my bag. It was not I wasn't, you know, as I say, I'm a data person in terms of it. And so the maps themselves, I was there when it was being done, and I was aware of the computer. If you'd have asked me to do some of the work on it, I could have done the light box stuff. And but yeah, so I'd need to do some digging back into the record for that.
No more than 16 megabits of RAM, I suspect.
Yeah. I mean, it was a great computer. We used to have, when I first joined, we had 2 desks and a very impressive computer system.
A big one.
A big one.
Really big.
Yes. I remember Andy standing in front of it and being very impressed with his computer. And
it heated the room, I suspect, as well.
It did.
Yeah. Next question. Thanks, Rick. What is the typical level of accuracy in geo-registration of adjacent maps in the same series, not those produced by different county surveying teams? I've come across some tile mismatching.
Yeah, so that's where that comes back to that. So the average error rate for the entire archive is plus or minus 5 meters.
Yeah.
But obviously, just individual ones will be slightly different within that. So that, as I say, that is an average. That's not uniform across the board. That everything will fall below 5 meters on the ground. There will be, and to my chagrin, there is one that I've seen that's around 20 meters in a corner. But the fixed points that we could take, we took a series of fixed points within the box. Obviously, the more fixed points you take on a map when you geo-rectify it, the more accurate you could go. But obviously, you could, in theory, pixelate the entire map, and still you wouldn't get absolutely spot-on accuracy.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
And another one, are there any tools for reading labels on Victorian era maps electronically? I'm interested in locating disused limestone extraction sites.
There's some great stuff being done in that, and I know at the university levels, there's been some great stuff being done on kind of text observers. It's machine learning, but it's looking at text and observing text and how the text was written. We still regards the text as a picture. We do some of that for some other projects. We haven't done that for this yet. We've done some work on looking at historic gazetteers, and I know there is a historic gazetteer out there which is really useful, but that is openly available. So it actually is probably worth that being an academic conversation. I know that there isn't anything commercially that has been launched that does that yet. We're not looking at that currently, doing machine learning to extract all the text as a digital layer. But that could be done.
Yeah, that's a complicated process, isn't it? Next question. I'm interested in rural buildings. Do the keys explain the difference between solid lines and dashed lines I sometimes see on the maps?
Yes.
Yes, they do.
And to be honest, Emma, if needed, we will. I think we did provide some of the Charles Close Society.
We have some of those in our help pages for Digimap.
Yeah,
yes,
that's worth going into. That's almost my Bible for that kind of information. But there are obviously information online. But yes, that kind of information should be in the standard legend. If not, it will definitely be in the Charles Close information.
Yeah, that's a good place to look. Yeah.
So I can
Jonathan
send
says,
everyone.
Yes, you could send that, couldn't you, Viv? Thanks.
Yeah, I can send those help pages. Someone's asking, are there any MOD maps in the data set or CAA/NATS maps?
Not CAA and NATS. We, in this archive, no, there isn't any MOD. We have MOD aerials. We don't have MOD maps. This is in our archive. There are some being released by MOD, certainly as they go out of, they're happy to. Obviously, their rules on publishing are their own. They can choose not to publish them necessarily if they feel there's a reason not to. Their archive's great. I will say that they're super. I've been in to the MOD map library building, and it is incredible.
Yeah, I bet.
So, the simple answer is no. It's probably the simple thing.
Okay. Next one then. How about tithe maps? We have been asked for tithe maps on a number of occasions over the years. Yes, it'd be a great resource to have digitized. Is that something Landmark might look at?
Very good one. We have in the past had discussions with the National Archive. The National Archive in Kew has the best collection of tithe. There were some issues with regards to how we could commercialise them, and therefore, unfortunately, the agreement. We were happy to make them available in the same way that is, but so we haven't digitised all the tithe. We have some odd bits and bobs, but nothing uniform. I know it does come up regularly with the National Archive of them to look to rectify their tithe mapping, and sometimes they look to see how they could fund that and work with it. So it's the National Archives that are the holders. Key.
Okay. Yeah, very useful. Thanks, Rick.
Okay, thank you for the questions, everyone. I think, do you think we should leave it at that, Emma?
Yes, we are running a little short on time.
Yeah.
If we want to do a demonstration of Digimap, then we will get back to you with the answers to the questions we haven't managed to answer just now. So thank you for the questions. They're all very useful, very interesting. If we've got a little bit of time left, it'd be useful to have a quick demo of Digimap, because I think maybe one or two of the questions that have been asked will get answered in Viv's demo.
Yeah, hopefully we will cover some of those. I'm just going to share my browser and have a quick look at Historic Digimap for you guys. Can I just get someone to confirm that they can see the Digimap homepage?
Yep, that's fine, Viv.
Okay, super. All right, so many of you might not have used Historic Digimap at all, so I'll just give you a quick run through of the applications which we have. So when you select Historic, you can choose Historic Roam. So that's where you can browse through all of the maps that Rick's been telling us about. You can add annotations to your map there and get a PDF print of your map. If you want the actual scanned TIFF images of the historic maps, whether that be national grid tiles or the original map sheets, you would go to Historic Data Download. That's where you'll get the georeference maps that you can then take into GIS and combine with your own data or whatever you wish to do. And we also have a web services area here. If I just select that, you'll see that what that allows you to do is take this link. You can copy and paste this URL into either your own software, whether that be perhaps GIS, or as I'm going to show you, you can use the links, these WMS links for each of our collections to combine, for example, the Ordnance Survey maps and the historic maps. So what I'll show you is how you take the OS link into Historic Digimap so you can view those together. So I'll give you a quick run through of Roam. All of our Roam applications for each collection work in the same way. So once you can use one, you can use them all. But I'll just show you some of the tools that I think are the most helpful when you're using Historic Roam. So when you open it up, you've got this map of GB. So I'm just going to zoom in on London. On the right here, you should be able to see that there's a timeline. So we're in the modern area of the timeline right now, but I'll zoom in and you should see the historic area become active. sorry, I'm calling it a timeline. I mean more of a scale bar, I beg your pardon. So let's zoom into central London. And as soon as we see a historic map, there's a timeline above the map, which will activate. So the timeline is now activated as I'm viewing a historic map. So what this allows you to do, whenever that's highlighted in white, you can just flick between the different decades and see what maps are available there. Now, I've zoomed into London to highlight this issue. Rick was mentioning between Devon and Cornwall that, you know, the Devon surveyors would map some of Cornwall. And that, I think, is best illustrated in London, where several counties are mapping central London. So in this decade that we're looking at, the 1890s, what I've done on the left here is open up an overlapping map selection tool. And that tells me that in this particular area, I'm viewing maps from Essex, Middlesex, Kent, London, and Surrey. So there's just a little toggle here. So I'm just going to select the Middlesex map. And that allows me to see this county map a lot more clearly. And you can see there is an area on the bottom right there, which hasn't been mapped. So if you do encounter an area where it looks very dark and blurry, it's in all likelihood there are some overlapping maps, and that just results from surveyors perhaps surveying over their county boundary. I'm not sure if there's another reason for that, Rick, but that's the reason that I was aware of.
I think the other possible explanation is the way we've put the maps together in Digimap. It means that we've classified things in particular decades, and there are some areas that don't. It's quite hard to describe. The areas are not mapped duplicate, but they appear in more than one decade, I think. There's something complicated about it. And what I wanted to flag was that somebody asked a question earlier about what looked like double scanned maps. I think that the double scanning you think you're seeing is in fact the overlapping maps. So this overlapping maps tab may resolve your problem there if you want to have a look at that.
Yeah. So we've covered the timeline, the overlapping map selection tool. You do have a little information icon at the top above the map window. If you select that and click anywhere on the map, you can get a little bit of information about the maps that are on display there. So it's come up with 3 county sheets here. So if I select the Middlesex one, as I've selected that from the overlapping map selection tool, it tells me what product it is. So that's the county series 1 to 10,560, which is a 6 inch to a mile that Rick was discussing. It's the first revision. I'll try and show you in data download how you can see what coverage we have for first editions, first revisions, and so on for Middlesex, and it was published in 1896. So that information tool is quite useful to try and get some data on the maps. I'm going to try and zoom in to Westminster here and try and get to a town plan. Rick mentioned that we have 1 to 1056 scale town plans. So I think that's probably still a 1 to 2,500. So I'm just going to try and bring up the information again to show you that, yeah, this is a town plan and 1 to 1056 scale. Now I'm going to move to Hull and show you a larger scale town plan and just show you another couple of features as well. Okay, so I've selected Hull and my timeline has changed again. When you move to a different area or perhaps pan around, it will remember the last decade that you were looking at. But whenever you move to somewhere new, it will, update the timeline to reflect what maps are available there. So I've just selected 1850s, and I can't see my scale bar, so I think I'm on a sort of county scale map here. Yep, the 6 inches to a mile for Yorkshire. So what's of interest to show you here, I was going to show you a more detailed town plan map. Before I do that, I'll just show you the how you can compare 2 maps of the same scale. So if I select 2 up, you'll see my window splits into 2, so I can view this 1850s map on the left, and then I can select a different decade on the right here. So I'll just select the 1960s so you can see clearly the development into what were rural areas in the 19th century. You can also compare a contemporary map. So we do have a contemporary map which you can select to compare as well. So a lot of users find that a useful feature, the ability to compare. But what I wanted to show you was that you can also bring in the current Ordnance Survey mapping, the more detailed mapping as well, via that web map service, which I showed you at the home page. So I've selected this overlays menu on the left here. And what this allows you to do is bring in a web map service, perhaps from another provider. You may have a web mapping service from a different provider that you'd like to view with the historic maps. But all of the ones that I've brought in here are from the Digimap services. So I haven't switched any of them on, but if I scroll down, hopefully you can see that I've got the Digimap Ordnance Survey license data here. So if I just toggle on that button, what that will do when I zoom into the right scale is it will bring in, well, it's done it at this scale actually, it's brought in the Ordnance Survey master map lines from our Ordnance Survey collection. So the Ordnance Survey master map, if you're not aware, is the most detailed mapping available of the UK. So if I just zoom in here, what you see is that we've now got a combination of the historic map. If I just select the 1890s here, we should be able to see a combination of historic mapping and our Ordnance Survey map. I'm going to muck around with these opacity sliders here, which hopefully makes that a bit more effective. But I just wanted to quickly highlight, we haven't got much time, that is something that you can do to bring in our other maps, for example, Ordnance Survey, or you could bring in geology, for example. And we do have a use case for that, and combine them. Now, the only other thing I wanted to highlight, I'll turn that off, is the existence of these drawing tools. I'm going to flip to another decade here. We do have, certainly from in our school students, they've been making a lot of use of these drawing tools to kind of outline perhaps the geographic size of an area in one decade and then compare it at a different point. So just to point out that there are these tools that allow you to add polygons and add measurements to them and add different markers depending on what it is you want to do with your map. That's all I'll say about those for the moment, that those drawing tools are there. Now I'm going to come out of Rome, unless there's anything, Emma, that you think is worthwhile me showing people at this point.
I think you've covered all the key things. The map information tab is maybe useful, but the information button is the most key one, because if you click on it, it will give you all the information about the map that you're looking at. Yep. And that will probably answer most questions, I think. The overlapping maps tab is the one that people often miss, which explains the blurriness, if you like.
Sure.
Yeah.
I did also say that I would show a Hull 1 to 500 town plan map, and I managed to not do that at all. So this is one that I saved just to show you the kind of detail that's available at the 1 to 500 scale. And I think another thing that's useful to point out is quite often when I'm using the Historic Digimap, I'll zoom in from the county to the urban and then, to the town plans. And often I get to perhaps a certain point, perhaps about, we've got these view names in the corner, this is called Plan 1, and there may not be anything available. You won't see any availability at any decade. But if you keep zooming in right to the sort of top 3, what we call our plan views, quite often something will pop up. So do sort of keep zooming in beyond the 1 to 2,500 scale to see what's available. And we do have a whole list, which I'll flick to here, of towns which have town plans. So I'll send that out in the follow-up as well, so that people can see clearly where there are town plans available. And the only other thing I thought was useful to point out is actually in our data download tool. Even if you don't want to download data, we do have this whole list of the series and the different revisions and so on. So if I've opened up the county series, for example, I've got a little availability grid there. And what that will do is it will shade the map of GB to show me where other maps, where there's coverage. And I can go through the different revisions. And as you go through the revisions, you see that fewer and fewer places were resurveyed at that point, as Rick highlighted to us. So in the data download, that's potentially quite a useful little function to be able to see what's available there. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and if people have got questions on Digimap which weren't covered by that, then do just shout. But we will go through the questions that you've given us and try and cover them after the event if we don't do that today.
How much time do we have left, Vish? I'm conscious it's already
well, that is
1:30,
1:30, so perhaps it is best just to leave it at that for today.
I'm aware that we haven't got through all the questions, but we will follow them up with the transcript and answer them on paper, as it were. I think that's probably sensible, and we'll circulate those later.
Yeah.
I think it just remains for us to say thank you very much to Rick for his time today. It's hugely valuable and very interesting. We're delighted that you are able to give us some time and energy like that. It's really much appreciated. Thank you to everyone else for paying attention for a quite long session. I hope you all found it very useful. The recording will be available for you to listen again if you're very keen. And as we said, we will send you transcripts, and Viv will send all the extra bits and pieces we've talked about today. Okay, and I think that's us for today. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.